Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to, I guess, what we're in week 4 now, if you can believe that. Again, these hybrid courses go by very, very quickly, and so we're actually over halfway through our semester together. So um, here on week 4, what we're planning on doing is we're going to get into the topic of budget formats, and then if time permits, budget analysis as well. Thank you for your pre-instructional assignments. I've gone through all of those that have been submitted and have provided very brief feedback. The only piece of feedback that I think is common to a lot of the assignments is just remember when you do part 1 of your post-instructional, uh, please remember on the revenue and the expenditure questions, if you just give me tables for both of those questions, and so in your answer, just give me for the revenue question, here are the top 3 sources of revenue. Here's the amount derived from each of those sources of revenue. And then here's the percentage of total revenue coming from each of those sources. Then for the expenditure question, here are the top 3 areas of spending. Here's the amount being spent on each of those 3 areas. And then here's the percentage of total expenditures that are being spent on that area. And so if you can just give me those tables for the revenue question, the expenditure question on the post-instructional assignment, other than that, I think we're good to go. When you do your part 1 of your post-instructional assignments, again, I think probably the easiest and best way to do it is just take your pre-instructional assignment, and then for any answers that are changing, just put those answers in red, and that will then denote your post-instructional answer. It's helpful for you and it's helpful for me as well, because I can then see here's your pre-instructional answer, and then followed by your post-instructional answer. And if it's in red or some other color, that just kind of helps delineate what's the pre-instructional versus what's the post-instructional answer. But otherwise, those have been returned. Everyone got full credit on the pre-instructional assignment. Again, there are no right or wrong answers. I know some folks answered the budget format question. Some folks decide not to answer inside, don't have the information. Whatever answer you gave there is acceptable because it is just a pre-instructional assessment. Tonight, we will cover the information that you need in order to then answer the budget format question on part 1 of the post-instructional assignment. Also tonight, if we do have time, we get into analysis. At the end of our discussion of analysis and budgeting, we will then also talk about some fiscal solvency indicators that will then help you answer the fiscal solvency questions on part 1 of the post-instructional as well. So we'll get into, if we have time permits, we'll get into Brown's 10-point indicators. We'll get into Wang, Tu, and Dennis and their indicators, and kind of show you some of the indicators you can use. I know a few people answered the fiscal solvency question and answered it in terms of what revenues are exceeding expenditures, which certainly is one of those indicators that is a valid indicator to use for fiscal solvency. But later tonight, we'll see there are a lot of other indicators as well. And so once we finish that discussion tonight on your post-instructional, what I hope you'll be able to do is maybe just take a handful, maybe 2 or 3 of the indicators that we talked about tonight, and then utilize those 2 or 3 indicators in answering the question on the post-instructional about the city's fiscal solvency. Moving forward, then, your next assignment coming up is then another Beach Board essay assignment that is due on the 19th, next Monday, I guess it is. And in that Beach Board assignment, what you'll do is you'll just share with us what budget format your city is using. And then if there's another budget format that you think would be more appropriate or better to use, what budget format do you think would be superior to the budget format that the city is currently using? So this answers to those 2 questions: what budget format the city is using, and then if there is a superior budget format, what is that superior budget format? That you answer those 2 questions in your Beach Board essay, if you could just at the bottom of your post, give me again the link to the budget so that I can just click on the link and go to the budget and then provide you feedback in terms of whether I agree or not that that is indeed the budget format the city is using. I won't engage that way in discussion board, but I will in your feedback and your grade. That's where I will say, well, you said this is a line item budget, but it does have some performance measures or something like that. So that type of substantive formative feedback I'll give you one-on-one in the grading area. I won't do that in the general discussion for everyone to see. So that's your next Beach Board essay coming up, budget format that the city is using. So that then brings us to our discussion now of budget format, so that we can provide you with the information you need to do your next Beach Board essay, as well as to answer that budget format question on part one of the post-instructional assignment. So the way in which I like to talk about budget formats, and there are four basic budget formats that we cover here in this class. Now, that's not the universe of budget formats. There are other budget formats that are also available for cities to use, but we just kind of highlight the four most common types of formats that you're most likely to run into when you're looking at a city's budget. But the way in which I like to talk about those four budget formats is to kind of create a context for understanding these formats. And I'll actually provide you with two different contexts that we can use to understand budget formats. The first context is as a decision-making tool. Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, when we did our introduction to public budgeting and finance, we wrapped up our discussion talking about different decision-making models that are used in budgeting. And I presented to you four different decision-making models: rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. I said, hold on to those four decision-making models because we are going to return to them in future class sessions. We're returning to them now with our discussion of budget formats. So as we go through our budget formats, I will highlight which decision-making model is emphasized by that budget format. So if you remember, just again, real quick recap: rational, comprehensive decision-making, we take into account all the information that is available to then put together a full range of alternatives for the purpose of selecting the best alternative to solve a problem. The best alternative is then what gets funded in our public budget. So it's a very rational, very comprehensive way of making decisions. Then the second decision-making model we talked about was incrementalism. And we said it's really incrementalism that carries the day in public budgeting. It's really incrementalism that we use most often when we're putting together public budgets. Incrementalism, we only make very small marginal changes from one year to the next. So when we develop this year's budget, we use last year's budget as our guide, and then we'll add on maybe 2 or 3% to make up for the inflation rates or make up for increases in the CPI or cost of doing business. But our budgets remain relatively steady and very static from one year to the next. We do incrementalism as our primary approach to budgeting because it is easy, it is very lack of resource intensive, that we don't need a lot of knowledge or a lot of resource or a lot of time to put budgets together in an incremental type of way. The third decision-making model we introduced was mixed scanning. And we said mixed scanning is a combination of rationality and incrementalism. We'll try and be as rational as we can be for big issues and big ticket items like new buildings or a new fleet of police vehicles, but then we'll be incremental for the much smaller, more mundane issues, such as the number of supplies we have to order for next year. So we kind of combine the rational and the incremental together. We said one of the benefits of mixed scanning is that it makes sense that you would want to take the time and the effort to be rational for big decisions, but not waste that time being rational on the smaller, more mundane decisions that are much more aligned with incrementalism. We said the problem, though, is it's subjective, in that what is one person's big issue may be someone else's small issue and vice versa. So there is that subjectivity that's naturally built into mixed scanning. And then the fourth model that we presented was zero-based budgeting. We'll get to zero-based budgeting, but the fourth model that we looked at was garbage can model, which is a lot like zero-based budgeting. But the fourth model was garbage can model of decision-making. And in garbage can model of decision-making, we said that there's some rationality involved in that we make decisions at the confluence of these four different streams that we discussed: the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and the choice opportunity stream. So if we have the right people in place, the right participants in decision-making positions, then they are predisposed to making a big change to the way in which we are budgeting and the types of expenditures that we are funding within our budgets. Then The second stream is the problem stream. We have to have a problem that is relatively well defined. It's a problem that people are familiar with, and they know it's been around for a while, and they know that it's important that that problem be solved. Then the third stream is that solution stream, where we said that what we'll do is we will not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but we will take solutions that were pre-existing, solutions that were applied to other pre-existing past problems, and then apply those solutions to our current problem. And all those streams tend to come together whenever something happens, whenever there's a choice opportunity or a triggering event that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change, a radical change in the way in which we are doing our business. So those are those four different decision-making models: rationality, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can. As we look at these budget formats, we can align these budget formats tonight with those different decision-making models. As we talk about each format, we will align it with the relevant decision-making model. So that's one context we can use to understand different budget formats. A second context that we can use to understand budget formats is a context provided to us by an author by the name of Alan Schick. And you can see his name on the screen there. And Alan Schick made the argument that we use different budget formats for different purposes. And so Schick identifies three main purposes that you can use your budget document and your budgeting process for. One purpose you can use your budget document for is for the purpose of control. So we want to control how much money we're spending, and we want to control what we are spending that money on. It's a basic element of budgeting. And we appropriate funds. Those appropriations tell us this is how we can legally spend the money, and this is how much money we have to legally spend. A budget format can be oriented around controlling those expenditures, what we're spending money on, how much money we're spending. So a traditional budget format, such as a line item budget, is very much oriented around the purpose of control. But we can go beyond just control with our budget formats, and we can use budget formats for other purposes as well. So another purpose we can use a budget format for is management. So we use the budget document to help us better manage the operations and processes in our organization. So if we want to try and manage our organization, we're going to need more information than what we would just get from a simple line item budget. We're going to have information about the activities that we are engaging in. We're going to have information about how the dollars are being spent on those activities. We're going to have information about the outputs that are being created by those activities, and oftentimes the outcomes, the consequences of those outputs or those goods and services that are being created, being produced with the money that we are spending. So if we want to use the budget document as a management tool, we need to generate additional information beyond just a line item budget. And that's information we can generate with a budget format known as performance-based budgeting. So whereas line item budgeting is aligned with the control function or the control purpose, performance-based budgeting is closely aligned with the management purpose of a budget document. Then the third purpose you can use a budget document for is the purpose of planning, to help you plan the operations of your organization as a tool for the strategic planning of your organization. And I know many of you in your organizations have probably lived through strategic planning processes. We have a major strategic planning initiative going on here at the university called Beach 2030, and everyone's participating in Beach 2030 as a strategic planning process. When you're engaging in strategic planning, as you probably know from your experience, you're identifying goals and you're identifying objectives, and then how you're going to achieve those goals and those objectives. Well, in doing that, you can also create a budget format known as a program type of budget. And in a program type of budget, or even in a zero-based type of budget, you are really trying to use your budget document for the purpose of planning the operations of your organization. And I'll show you some examples in a few minutes to kind of show you how a program-based or a zero-based budget allows you to contribute to the planning purpose of your budget format. So Those three purposes, control, management, and planning, whatever we want to accomplish with our budget document will then clue us in terms of which budget format would be most appropriate to achieve those types of purposes with our budget document. So that's kind of the second context that we're going to use. So we're going to understand these four formats in terms of the relationship to our four decision-making models, as well as the relationship to these three main purposes of budgeting presented to us by Alan Schick. I just think those are two nice contexts that we can use to better understand when it would be appropriate to use one budget format as opposed to another budget format. So again, the very simple traditional type of budget format is a line item budget. And a line item budget is like what I provided to you to use in preparing part 2 of your post-instructional assignment. So I actually even called the Excel spreadsheet line item because it is a line item budget. In a line item budget like the one I provided to you, you have a listing of all of your objects of expenditure, all the things you're spending your money on, and then the amount of money that's being spent on each one of those items. That is all the information that you really get with a line item budget. So if you want to use that line item budget for this year to help you plan your budget for next year, all you know is what you spent money on this year and how much money you spent on each one of those objects. It's a very limited amount of information. It's a very traditional approach to budgeting. Line item budgeting really emphasizes Schick's control purpose of a budget document. We have enough information to control how much money we're spending and what we are spending that money on. But we don't really have information there that will help us manage or better manage the productivity of our organization. We just have the information we need for controlling spending. It is very much in line with incremental decision making because we get those very small changes from year to year because we don't have the information in our budget document to make large full-scale changes to what we have done in previous years. One of the primary advantages of line item budgeting is that it is a very limited approach to budgeting. It's very easy to do, and it's not terribly resource intensive. You just use last year's budget as a guide for next year's budget. Another advantage is that with line item budgeting, it allows us to avoid making big mistakes because we're never going to have whole-scale changes to what we are funding in our budgets. We're going to just keep funding the same expenditures year after year after year. So we're not going to have those big mistakes, but we are going to repeat small mistakes. And so if we've got a program that is not being fully effective and not accomplishing its goals, we're not really going to know that with our budget document. So we're going to continue funneling money into that program year in and year out and continue repeating those same mistakes each and every fiscal year. Now, that being said, with those disadvantages of line item budgeting, we also have to acknowledge that line item budgeting is the staple that we use in putting together our public budgets, especially at the local level of government. And I can guarantee you pretty much 100% that every single city budget that you look at for this class will at least have a line item component to it if it's not completely line item, or at least have a section that is line item budgeting. So line item budgeting is pretty much universal at the local and oftentimes also the state level of government as well. So that's kind of your default. When you're looking at your city budget, chances are it's going to, if not be completely line item, at least have a pretty heavy line item component to it. But it's a very limited type of budgeting, only allows us to control our expenditures in a very incremental type of decision-making process. The second budget format is what's called performance-based budgeting. And again, once we're done with this general discussion, I'll show you some specific examples of what performance-based budgeting looks like. But a performance-based budgeting is just what it sounds like. We are starting to incorporate performance measurements into our budget document. So we're now using the budget document not just for control, but now we're also using it for Schick's second purpose, which is management. We're using our budget document as a management tool. So we're going to incorporate empirical indicators of performance for the activities we are spending money on. So back when I used to teach back east where we had snow and snow removal programs, I would use the example Mike Sill oftentimes uses, which is the snow removal program and a performance-based budget for that snow removal program. And so what that budget would do is it would include the activities that money is being spent on. And so we'll have an activity such as plowing the streets. As you have snow plows, you go out there and you plow the streets. In order to melt the snow, you also use salt, rock salt. And so you'll have salting of streets as well as another activity. So a performance-based budget would show how much money is being spent on all those hours spent plowing the streets, all those hours spent salting the streets, and we'll then have performance indicators. And so a performance indicator of clearing the roads could be the number of accidents where snow was a contributing factor. Ostensibly, if you're doing a good job clearing the streets, obviously you will have fewer accidents where snow is a contributing factor. Citizen complaints. How many complaints are you getting from citizens that the streets are not being adequately cleared? Those are all performance indicators we can use to measure the management of that and the effectiveness of that snow removal program. So we take our inputs, the money coming into that snow removal program, and we then link that up to the activities, what we are spending that money on, and then we'll link those activities up to how well we are accomplishing our performance expectations by having empirical indicators of effectiveness. As you can see with a performance-based type of budget, what we are doing is we are incorporating a lot of additional information that will allow us to use that budget as a management tool beyond just controlling how much money we are spending. Now, it's also worth noting that performance-based budgeting is not new. Performance-based budgeting has been around for decades, but it's gone through an evolution. So that back in the 1950s and the 1960s, when performance budgeting was starting to take off at the local level, that type of performance-based budgeting is what we refer to as classical performance-based budgeting. In the classical performance-based budgeting of the 1950s and the 1960s, we were focusing very much on what we call outputs, the products and services that we were creating with the money that we were spending. So we are looking at those outputs, those products and those services, those goods that we are creating with the public taxpayer money that we are spending as an organization. Then in the 1970s and the 1980s, performance-based budgeting kind of fell out of favor a bit, and you saw fewer organizations using performance-based budgeting. But it then had a renaissance in the 1990s and into the 2000s with a new approach to performance-based budgeting. In the new approach to performance-based budgeting, the more recent approach that we've seen a lot of local governments get involved in, the focus goes beyond just the outputs. It goes beyond just measuring the products and the goods and the services that are being created. And now we're focusing on the outcomes. And outcomes are the consequences of the consumption of those products and services. So citizens are going to consume those outputs. And by consuming those outputs, they are then going to experience certain consequences, hopefully some benefits from consuming those outputs. Those benefits, those long-term consequences, long-term benefits, those are what we refer to as our outcomes. So the new approach to performance-based budgeting focuses much more on outcomes than merely outputs. Now, you could be likely to see some element of performance-based budgeting used in your city. So in order to see whether or not your city is using a variation on performance-based budgeting, you're going to be looking for identification of performance measures, empirical indicators of effectiveness. Those are the types of things that you're looking at in order to determine whether or not your city is using a performance-based budget. Now, even though I'm going to show you an example of performance-based budget in a couple of minutes, it's important to recognize that there's no one type of performance-based budget. That performance-based budgets can take on a variety of different manifestations. It is very common for cities when they do performance-based budgeting to start their budget with a line item approach and then add in those performance measurements later on in the budget. So it's kind of a combination of a line item and performance-based approach. That's kind of the modality or the most common type of performance-based budget that's being used by a city. So when you're looking at your city's budget, if you see any of those performance indicators, if you see any empirical indicators linking up what our activities are to the accomplishment of goals and objectives, then you can, with great confidence, say you have a performance-based budget. Even though it has a line item component, you can still call that a performance-based budget because it has those performance indicators built into the budget document. Second to a line item budgeting is the most common you'll see in local governments here in Southern California. The second most common will be a performance-based budget. So it's not unusual whatsoever to see performance-based budgets used by local governments here in Southern California. And again, I'll show you an example how it works in just a second. And a lot of states use performance-based budgeting, very common across the country. The third budget format is then what's referred to as a program-based budget. Now, the program-based budget, we are moving from a management focus to a planning focus. Now we want to go beyond just using the budget to manage our effectiveness and our performance as an organization. Now we want to use the budget format to help us plan our operations, to help us kind of take that 30,000-foot helicopter view of our organization to see how all the different disparate elements of our organization are working together to help us accomplish our goals and our objectives. So it's used for that type of a planning type of function. In terms of our decision-making models, again, line item was very much incremental in nature. Performance-based budgeting starts to bring a little bit more rationality into our discussion of our budget format. Once we get into program-based budget, we are fully in the decision-making model of rationality. So we're bringing a lot more rational elements into the creation and analysis of our budget document. So the big thing about program-based budget is that if your city is using a program-based budget, you will know it, because a program-based budget looks much different in its organization than a line item or a performance-based budget. Typically, line item and performance-based budgets are organized around departments and units. So you'll have a police department budget. You'll have a fire department budget. You might have an emergency response budget or something like that, but you'll have budgets that are oriented around your traditional departmental or unit boundaries. That's where line item performance budgets. In a true program-based budget, you break down those boundaries between your departments. And instead of organizing your budget according to department, you organize your budget according to program. So in a program-based budget, instead of having your budget organized around the police department or the fire department, it will be organized around a program such as protection of persons and property. So here are all the activities that we are funding that will help us achieve our goals in the protection of persons and property within our city. Some of those activities may be done by a police department. Some of those activities may be done by the fire department. But irrespective of which department is carrying out those activities, all the activities that contribute to the goal of protecting persons and property, all those activities get funded together under that program, protection of persons and property. So the budget looks a lot different than it would under a line item or a performance-based budget. You are truly organizing your budget around the program rather than organizing around the department. And one really common strategy that is typically used when we do program-based budgeting is a strategy known as crosswalking. And in crosswalking, what we will do is we will array all of the activities that we are engaging in according to the goals that they are meant to achieve. So this activity is meant to achieve this goal. This activity is meant to achieve this goal. And we'll literally draw up a matrix and we'll put X's in the cells linking the activity with the goal that it is meant to try and achieve. We then take similar goals and we combine them together into what we call programs, and then we can see all the different activities that are contributing to those programmatic goals, irrespective, again, of what department those activities are actually occurring within. So it's a much more holistic view of our organization with a program-based as compared to a performance or a line item type of budget. Now, all that being said, it's much less likely that you will see a program budget than a performance-based budget. And it's probably a little bit less likely you'll see a performance-based budget as compared to a line item budget. So I'd assume the majority, at least my experience of using this assignment over the past several years, is that the vast majority of folks will see their city using a line item budget. Some will see some performance elements in terms of a performance-based budget. Very few will see a program-based budget because it is relatively unusual. It's unusual to see at the local level because, number one, it's very resource intensive. And number two, in order to do a program-based budget, you must already have a very vibrant, ongoing strategic planning process. If you have not been engaging in strategic planning, it's going to be difficult for you to put together your crosswalking matrix and determine what activities are related to which goals, because you've never really sat down and given that a whole lot of thought. So organizations that haven't spent a lot of time and energy doing strategic planning probably will not be well equipped for a program type of budget. So that's one reason why we oftentimes don't see it used that much at the local level. So it does require strategic planning. It is very resource intensive. And there's also some hesitation and reluctance on the part of managers to use a program-based budget. Now think about if you are a police chief and you're in charge of the police department, you do want control over your budget. You want control over the police department budget. And you might be hesitant to see some of those activities you're doing, your officers are doing in the police department, being budgeted together with the fire department under a different type of program umbrella. And so sometimes it's that loss of control that really makes managers a little hesitant and reluctant to pursue program-based budgeting. And so there's a real confluence of reasons why we tend not to see program-based budgeting used a whole lot at the local level. Program-based budgeting is very popular in certain agencies at the federal level. The Department of Defense has been using program-based budgeting since the 1960s and still uses at least an element of program-based budgeting today, but very unusual to see it at the local level. And then our fourth budget format is one that's called zero-based budgeting, or ZBB, zero-based budgeting. Now, you are unlikely to see zero-based budgeting used by a local government because it is so resource intensive. But here's the way zero-based budgeting works. Zero-based budgeting is kind of a combination of rationality and garbage can model of decision making. But there's a whole lot of rationality involved in it. Zero-based budgeting is also used to try and emphasize the planning feature, the planning purpose of a budget document. So like program-based budgeting, zero-based budgeting also emphasizes this planning purpose for a budget document. But the way zero-based budgeting works is it is very much of a bottom-up type of budgeting process. So typically under a regular line item budget, what will happen is you'll have the budget constructed at the upper management levels of the organization. And it's your top level managers that put together the budget for their units or for their departments. So it tends to be a very top-down type of situation. In zero-based budgeting, it tends to be much more bottom-up in that you go to the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions can be made. So you look at your organizational structure and you ask the question, what is the lowest level in this organization chart where budget decisions can be made? Once you identify that lowest level where budget decisions can be made, you identify those as being what you call your decision units. So a decision unit is the lowest level where budget decisions are made. Each one of those decision units, and you'll have multiple decision units within your organization. You could, depending on the size of your organization, you could have dozens of decision units, or even for very large organizations, maybe 100 decision units. But all these units will then put together what are called a series of decision packages. So each unit will create multiple decision packages. In these decision packages, the units will then put forth different alternatives for funding a certain type of activity. So, here is if we fund the activity at 100% of what we funded at last year. Here are the consequences of that. Well, if we funded at 100% of what we funded at last year, because of increasing inflationary costs and cost of doing business, chances are we're probably not going to be able to provide the same level of service that we did last year, just because providing that service is much more costly today than it was last year. So that's the consequence. Maybe we're able to serve 100 fewer constituents than we were able to serve last year by just having our spending being static. But what are the consequences if we spend 110%, so 10% more than we spent last year? Well, maybe we can serve an additional 200 constituents. Well, that's a consequence, a positive consequence of spending 110%. What if we only spend 90% of what we spent last year? Well, we're probably going to be able to serve 200 fewer constituents, and that's going to be a negative type of consequence. But in these decision packages, you put forth all these different alternatives and the results or the consequences that accrue with each one of those alternatives. So your decision units put together multiple decision packages, dozens of decision packages. These decision packages are then ranked and prioritized by the decision units. And then those ranked decision packages are then sent up the organizational chart to the next level of management. Those middle level managers will then re-rank and reprioritize those decision packages. Will then send their ranked decision packages up to the top level of the organization. Upper level management will then re-rank and reprioritize those decision packages. The highest ranked decision packages then get funded in the budget based upon the money that is available to fund those packages. The lowest ranked decision packages then do not make it into that organization's budget. So you can see it is a very rational process in that we're just not accepting what we did last year. We are challenging what we are doing and asking, is there another way to do it? Is there a different way to fund this program? Or maybe perhaps another program altogether that should be funded instead of the program that we funded last year. So it really requires you to go back and re-justify the programs you are spending money on and the types of things that you are doing, thus making a much more rational, comprehensive approach to budgeting than what you had with an incremental approach like line item budgeting. Now, the problem obviously with zero-based budgeting is that it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of resources. The state of Virginia is a state that uses a very rigorous zero-based budgeting process for all of its state agencies. And individual state agencies may produce hundreds or thousands of decision packages that they're going to have to consider and rank and prioritize. But imagine the amount of paperwork and imagine the amount of time and energy it will take to put together hundreds and sometimes even up to 1,000 different decision packages. In the state of Virginia, each decision package is anywhere from 40 to 50 pages in length because there are justifications, narrative justifications written for each one of the scenarios in each one of those decision packages. So it's just an immense undertaking. Zero-based budgeting was brought into the federal level by President Carter. President Carter, before he was president, was governor of Georgia. As governor of Georgia, he saw Texas Instruments using zero-based budgeting, using it with a lot of success. So he thought, let me take zero-based budgeting from the private sector and put it into Georgia state government. He did that while he was governor of Georgia. He was happy with the results. So when he became president, he decided to bring zero-based budgeting to the federal level of government as well. It was far less successful at the federal level than it was in the state of Georgia because of the immense scope and size of the federal government. Because the federal government is so huge, zero-based budgeting was just not practical to do because of the size of the federal budget and the size of the federal bureaucracy. For those reasons, zero-based budgeting is oftentimes not practical at the local level of government either. There's a way you can make zero-based budgeting a little bit more practical, and that's through making a modified zero-based budgeting process. In a modified ZBB, what you will do is you'll oftentimes take a percentage of your budget every year and subject it to zero-based budgeting. Then the remainder of your budget then gets budgeted in your simple line item approach that you've always used. So a really common manifestation of modified zero-based budgeting is an 80-20 approach. 80% of your budget will be budgeted in a line item incremental way, like you've always done it. Doesn't take you a lot of time, doesn't take a lot of resources or a lot of thought. But then 20% of your budget will then be subjected to zero-based budgeting. Creates a lot less paperwork than doing the entire budget in a ZBB approach. So this year you'll do this 20% in zero-based budgeting. Next year a different 20%. The third year a different 20%, and so on and so on. So that once every 5 years, every agency and every program will have to go through a zero-based budgeting process. So it's a modified approach to zero-based budgeting to make it a little bit more realistic. I really do want to emphasize to you, though, that the main difference between zero-based budgeting and our other three budget formats is that zero-based budgeting is really much more of a process than it is an actual finished budget format. It is quite possible that you can go through a zero-based budgeting process and then end up with a final budget document that looks very much line item or performance in nature. Because the zero-based budgeting is really the process itself that you go through in putting the budget together. Now, the natural question is, if zero-based budgeting is a process, how am I supposed to see it when I look at my city's budget format? If you're not able to see it in your budget format, you will see it in the narrative description that's provided with your budget. So if you probably notice in looking at your city's budget, there's always a letter of transmittal. The letter of transmittal oftentimes comes from the city manager's office. In that letter of transmittal, if your city is using zero-based budgeting as a process to put their budgets together, you can guarantee they will tell you that. They're going to scream that from the rooftops, because zero-based budgeting is such a time and resource intensive process. They're going to want everyone to know it. So I recommend you read through that letter of transmittal, because if your city is doing zero-based budgeting, they will tell you that very upfront in their letter of transmittal. Again, that being said, it's very unlikely that your city is doing zero-based budgeting because of the amount of resources and time that it requires. Vast majority, you'll see line item, maybe some performance budgeting features as well. Katerina, go ahead.
Thanks. I had a question slash comment, because I find this ZBB very interesting. It almost seems like there's like a Goldilocks sweet spot of like the size of the public entity that would be even using this. But I'm also wondering, to what degree, like, does lobbying, or just, I want to say, like, relationship management, similar to like what you see in collective bargaining, plays into ZBB? Because I'm wondering, you know, how much negotiating behind the tables happens in terms of trying to always keep your I guess your rank in place as it goes through the whole ZBB process. So yeah, I don't know if you can speak to, I guess, I don't know another better word other than the relationship making in order to maintain your rank on the ZBB process.
Right. Yeah, and those are great points. Those are two excellent points. The first point in terms of that sweet spot in terms of the size of the organization that would be able to effectively do zero-based budgeting. It really is kind of can't be too big and can't be too small. If you're too big, that just creates way too much paperwork and it's just not practical to do it. If you're too small, you may not have the expertise, or you may not have the people in place to be able to do zero-based budgeting. And so you kind of look at that happy medium of kind of medium-sized organizations. Those tend to be the ones that have a little bit more success doing zero-based budgeting. So I think the Goldilocks analogy is a great one in terms of the proper size. It can't be too big and can't be too small for zero-based budgeting to work. The second point on relationships is a really great one as well, especially when we're looking at unionized employees and unionized organizations. So because you're doing this bottom-up type of approach to ZBB, what you end up with is you end up with budgeting being part of the core functions of certain managers within the organization. And a lot more people in the organization have budgeting as a core function, as compared to if you're just doing a simple line item budget, whereby it's only the top level managers that have that as their core function. Once something becomes a core function, you know, assuming that your managers are unionized, which sometimes they aren't in organizations, but assuming that they are organized and assuming that they do have a collective bargaining agreement, if something becomes a core function, then that could very easily find its way into a collective bargaining agreement. And once it finds its way into a collective bargaining agreement, then it kind of gets cemented in that collective bargaining agreement until the next meet and confer or the next renegotiation, the next bargaining cycle. And so sometimes, you know, organizations are a little reluctant because once they give people those core functions, it then becomes part of their description. It then becomes part of the collectively bargained process and then gets kind of cemented into that collective bargaining agreement. And so you do have those type of relationship things you have to worry about as well when you do have unionized employees and a unionized type of organization. And there is a lot of give and take here because if you're a manager of a unit, and you've got certain programs that you're implementing in your unit, obviously you're going to become a champion, you know, like what Anthony Downs referred to as an advocate for the programs within your unit. And so obviously you're going to rank those programs decision packages much higher than somebody from another unit within your organization. And so you do kind of have this turf protection, if you will, that goes on in putting these decision packages together. You get some strategic misrepresentation, as Mike Sell talks about in his textbook, some budget maximization that goes on as well to try and protect your turf in the types of programs that you're advocating in those decision packages. So those are both, I think, excellent points. Would you say performance-based budgeting aligns significantly with incentives and incentivization? It does. I mean, performance-based budgeting allows us hopefully to have these empirical indicators of performance. Once you have built those empirical indicators of performance into your budget document, you then kind of pave the way for pay for performance. Because now we have quantifiable or at least empirical indicators of performance that we can then use for assigning compensation through bonus pay or merit pay. And so sometimes I think it's a very good point that organizations that have done a good job with performance-based budgeting, and they have a long history of performance-based budgeting, are perhaps a little bit more amenable than to a pay-for-performance approach than organizations that have not thought about and have not put together those performance indicators within their budget. So I would say absolutely. It does really gear itself toward bonus pay, merit pay, and pay-for-performance systems. Another excellent point. But again, you know, your organization, your city that you're looking at is probably going to be more in the realm of line item budgeting, maybe line item with a few performance indicators built in. Chances are you're not going to see a program-based budget, but if your city is using program-based budgeting, you will know it because it will be organized around the program rather than the unit or the department. And if they're doing zero-based budgeting as their process, you'll know it because they will certainly tell you all about it in their letter of transmittal. But let's take a look at some of these budget formats. I've got some examples. I have them up on our Beachboard site as well. But let me go ahead and show you if I've still got them around here. Let's see. Let's open up all the windows. Actually, to try and make this a little bit easier, let me just share my screen and then I'll just go ahead and show you the examples. Okay. Let me stop our slides. Okay. And I've got some examples here. They're all PDF files, and again, they're available for you on our Beachboard site. But you know what a line item budget looks like because that's the one I gave you for your post-instructional assignment part 2. So you know what that looks like. Here's a performance-based budget. Hopefully you can see the PDF file. It says Exhibit TX-2. Everybody see that? Yes, hopefully. Hoping that's showing for you. This is an example from actually the state of Texas. And in this example, we are looking at the Department of Aging. So we're focusing on a department like we would normally do in a performance-based or a line item budget. So with the Department of Aging, you can see their mission there. Let me move some windows out of the way. So their mission, the Department of Aging, is the state's visible advocate and leader in providing for comprehensive and coordinated continuum of services, opportunities, so that older people can live dignified lives. In this budget, whoa, sorry about that. move quickly. In this budget, you have goals. And so our goal here is service distribution is goal 1 or A. For goal A, service distribution, to enable older Texans to live dignified, independent, and productive lives within a safe living environment through an accessible, locally based, comprehensive, and coordinated continuum of services and opportunities. Here are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in order to achieve this goal. Percent of older population receiving services who are low income, 81%. Percent of older population receiving services who are moderately to severely impaired, 25%. Percent of older population receiving services who remain independent due to these services, 85%. And then for our recommended budget for next year, percent of nursing homes with a certified ombudsman, 73%. And then you have all of your, so those are your outcomes, and then you have specific strategies. This thing is moving so quickly. Strategies that you are going to engage in order to achieve those goals. So here are the strategies. A11 strategy, connections. Provide a statewide, locally based system that connects people with the services and benefits they need through ombudsman services, options, case management, information, and legal assistance. So the activities we're going to engage in, the actual outputs that we're going to be creating, we're going to fund 860 certified ombudsmen. We're going to fund, or we're going to have 8,730 people who receive options case management. We're going to have 300 unlicensed nursing assisted living facilities that have been identified. The cost per certified ombudsman is $28.64. The cost per options case management client is $256. We're spending $12,348,031 on this strategy of connections with ombudsman and with case management. Then we have a second strategy of providing nutrition services. Nutrition services, we're going to spend $37.4 million on. We're going to serve 4,170,000 congregate meals, 4,497,800 home delivered meals, 15,130,000 meals reimbursed by the USDA. There are your efficiencies in terms of cost per congregate meal of $3.25, cost per home delivered meal of $2.95. And I'm not going to go through it all, but you kind of get the idea that you're saying, for this Department of Aging, here are the goals that we are trying to achieve and the outcomes we're trying to achieve in those goals. Then here are the specific strategies, the activities, the outputs that we are going to engage in order to help us achieve those goals and those outcomes. And here's the amount of money we're spending on each one of those strategies, each one of those activities. So you're linking your inputs, the money you are spending, with the activities and strategies you're engaging in, with the outputs you're creating and the outcomes, the consequences that will accrue for the people who are benefiting from consuming those outputs and those products and those services. We have our cost per certified ombudsman, our cost per options case management client, our cost per congregate meal. We have some actual empirical indicators that show us how much we are spending per unit of what we are creating. So you've got a lot of performance-based measures that are built into a performance-based budget that you can then take that information and use it to better manage your organization. If you feel that $3.25 per congregate meal served is too much, then we're going to have to find some efficiencies to try and lower that $3.25 per unit cost, hopefully down to maybe $3 or $2.95. We're going to have to find some efficiencies there because we now know how efficiently and how effectively we are spending the money that we are receiving as an organization. So any types of performance measures that you see built into your city's budget, for our purposes in this class, will then qualify that budget as a performance-based budget. However, if your budget is just line item, object of expenditure, the amount of money that's being spent, you don't see these activities and these strategies and these outputs and these outcomes, then you probably just have a traditional line item budget, which is, again, the most common type of budget that I think most folks are going to run into as you look at your city budgets. And that's kind of an example of what we call a performance-based budget, incorporating those performance measurements into our budgeting document to help us better manage our organizations. This next example is kind of a mixture of a program-based budget and a performance-based budget. It's a program-based budget because it's oriented around a program rather than a specific department or a specific unit. But it also then incorporates some performance measurement standards in the budget as well. So it's kind of a hybrid of a program performance-based budget. This example comes from Sunnyvale, California, and this is for a program called Police Services. So again, they're not budgeting according to the police department. This is a set of services known as Police Services. Now, you can have other departmental activities from other departments that contribute to police services. So maybe you might have a separate emergency preparation department, and some of their work, some of their activities may contribute to what's going on here in this program known as Police Services. So in this program known as Police Services, our goal here is to provide a safe community and a feeling of security among our citizens by the protection of lives, property, and rights of all people, the deterrence and prevention of crime, the apprehension and prosecution of offenders, the maintenance of order and resolution of conflict, and the prompt response to incidents requiring immediate police attention. So this is what we are trying to achieve here in this program of Police Services. How are we going to specifically do it? We are going to specifically do it by trying to achieve these different standards. So here's standard number one under Service Delivery Plan Measure. We want to try and achieve an average 7-year weighted FBI crime index crime rate per 100,000 population that is 54% below the national weighted FBI crime rate, 63% below the California weighted FBI crime rate, and 38% below the Santa Clara County weighted FBI crime rate. So here are what we are trying to achieve. Here are our performance measures that we are trying to achieve. And then you can see you have multiple performance measures. Then you have performance measures for the clearance rate for specific crimes of murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and burglary, specific mean response times for emergency phone calls, dollar loss per citizen due to property crime, community perception of safety of 85% or above achieved, customer satisfaction rating of 80% or above for police services is achieved. These are our performance measures that we are trying to achieve. Then, scroll it down. Hold on one second. Move this. Then, as you scroll down, you'll see here's another service plan, crime control and order maintenance. And here's what we're trying to do with crime control and order maintenance. Again, still within this program of police services. Here's what we're actually going to be spending our money on. So we're spending our money on activity 412000, provide police patrol. So here are the number of hours that we're going to have patrol officers patrolling, the amount of money we're going to spend on it, the amount of hours that money will pay for. Our response to non-emergency calls. Here's the amount of money we are spending on it. Here's the amount of hours we're spending responding to non-emergency calls, urgent calls, events. You can see all the different activities. So what you're doing here is you're saying for this program of police services, which makes it a program type of budget, here are our performance, here are our goals for the program, and here are the performance measurements that we're trying to achieve. And then here are the activities, the specific activities we're going to be spending money on. So you link your money to the activities. Those activities are then linked up to your performance indicators, which are linked up to your goals and objectives for that program. So you can kind of see how it kind of creates for you almost like a workflow type of chart where you can link your inputs to the outcomes that you are producing for people as an organization. So this is kind of this program / performance budget because it has elements of both the program budget as well as a performance-based budget. And again, I've got this example up on our website. You can go at your leisure and take a look at it because we really don't have time to dissect it here in class because we have a lot to cover. But that's kind of the example of organizing your budget around a program. So this is pretty easy for you to see with your city. So if you're looking at your city budget and you see it says police department, fire department, senior citizen center or whatever, that's going to be something that is not going to be program based. I mean, that's something that is organized around units and departments. It's probably going to be line item unless there are performance measures, then it becomes a performance type of budget. If you see your budget organized around programs themselves rather than units and departments, then you probably have yourself a program type of budget. As I said, for a zero-based budget, if your city's doing a zero-based budget, it's the process much more so than the format. And so you can look at your budget. Your budget may look a lot like the line item budget, but the process they used to put that line item budget together was a zero-based budgeting process. So here's a really simple example of what a decision package could look like in a zero-based budgeting process. Again, this is a very simplified example. So here, this is for, let's say, a library system. The decision unit is the special programs office within that library. So that's your decision unit. That's the lowest level of the organization where budget decisions can be made. So the special programs office will put together a series of different decision packages. Decision package number one is the provision of a bookmobile. So the purpose of the bookmobile is to provide service to remote regions served by the library, enhance quality of life for the county's homebound and senior citizens or citizens without access to transportation. So that's the purpose of our bookmobile. Here are different alternative funding approaches. One alternative funding approach is to fund it at 90% of base, which means 90% of what we funded the bookmobile at last year. That will allow us to pay for 25 hours per week with this bookmobile at a cost of $36,000. The second alternative is to maintain our current level of funding, which would give us 30 hours per week. We can operate the bookmobile at a cost of $40,000, or we can enhance it 10%. So it's funded at 110% of what we funded at last year. We can operate the bookmobile 35 hours per week at a cost of $44,000. So what are the consequences? Well, obviously, if we fund it at less than the optimal amount, reduced funding means we're going to have lower circulation rates among our elderly library patrons. So we'll be able to serve fewer people. We'll have lower circulation rates among this target population. There was an alternative to the bookmobile, and that was a van service. But when we looked at the van service, the insurance costs were too high, so we eliminated the van service idea, and we're sticking with the bookmobile. But at least we thought about other alternatives to this bookmobile program, and we're thinking about alternative funding levels for that bookmobile program as well. Then decision package number two, in-school programs to encourage library use among grade school students and to enhance existing literacy programs targeted at low-income neighborhood schools. So again, you've got your three different alternative funding levels. At the base, 90% of last year, we can do 8 hours a week at $22,500. 100%, we can do 2 hours per week and focus on 2 elementary schools, $25,000 cost. Enhance 110% of what we spent last year, 12 hours per week, $27,500. Consequences of funding at a lower level, obviously reduced funding may affect literacy efforts and standardized test scores. The alternative was an after-school program at the library, but it was rejected because, again, of insurance costs and the cost of staffing. Then decision package three, and you can see we're not going to go through them all, but you kind of get the idea of how decision packages work. Here are alternative ways to fund it, and then here are other ideas we thought about that were something we could do instead of the programs in this decision package. But you're putting a lot of thought, you're putting a lot of effort into really rationally thinking about what we are doing, different ways of doing it, and if there are other approaches that could be superior. You take all these decision packages, you then rank them, prioritize them. They move their way up the organizational chart until at the top level, the highest ranked decision packages are then the ones that are the priority for the organization. Those decision packages then get put together into the organization's budget. And again, it's very much of this process that we are going through to then create our final budget document. Now, I mentioned the state of Virginia is an example of a state that has really bought into zero-based budgeting. Their decision packages are obviously much lengthier than this. They're much more detailed. This is just kind of a classroom example. their decision packages are required to be no less than 40 pages. And they will have a much longer, much more detailed justifications for each one of these alternative funding levels. So it takes a lot of time and it takes a whole lot of effort. Here in California, we do have a variation of a modified zero-based budgeting process, where every year we subject a certain selection, a certain sample of agencies to zero-based budgeting. It's not 20%, so it's not that broad scale, but there will be a handful of agencies every year that get selected kind of on a, not really a pilot basis because we've been doing it for a while, but on a very limited basis to go through a zero-based budgeting type of process. Now, as we said, you're not going to see this probably in your local government. In all the years I've been doing this class, I've seen probably a handful of post-instructional assignments where the city truly was going through a zero-based budgeting process. I know in the past, so 1 to 2 cities in Southern California that have used zero-based budgeting. I think by now those cities have kind of moved away from it because it is so resource and time intensive. So most likely what you're going to see is you're going to see line item budgeting, perhaps line item with a few performance indicators built in that you can then call a performance-based type of budget. But those are the 4 main budget formats. Now, again, that's not the universal budget format. There are others. Priority-driven budgeting. I have an example of that up on our website. There's envelope budgeting. There are a lot of different other types of budgeting formats. These are the 4 primary budgeting formats that we tend to run into here in the US. If you go up in Canada, envelope budgeting is something that's pretty common. Priority-driven budgeting is more common in European nations. Here, those are the 4 main budget formats we tend to use: line item, performance, program, and zero-based. At the local level, typically line item and performance-based budgeting. So again, when you think about these 4 different budget formats, go back to our beach board site, take a look at these examples I have up there. When you do have time, you can spend a little bit more time going through them, getting a little bit more familiar with them. But think about these 4 budget formats in terms of the 2 contexts that we started tonight with. Number 1, what type of decision-making model do they reflect? Are they more rational? Are they more incremental in nature? And then the second context, what purpose do they serve? Do they really lend themselves toward control, like a line item budget, or management, like a performance-based budget, or lend themselves toward the planning, strategic planning feature, like a program-based budget and a zero-based budget? So those are our 4 budget formats. Hopefully that gives you some information now that you can use to answer that budget format question once you get to part 1 of your post-instructional assignment. Any general questions before we take a quick break tonight about those 4 different budget formats? Okay. And I'll let you digest that information for a little bit. Let's go ahead and take a break. Let's say we'll take a break until, we'll call it 5:20. Come back at 5:20, and then we'll shift gears and we'll get into analysis. And hopefully if things go well with our discussion of analysis, we'll be able to have some time to get into those indicators of fiscal solvency to then give you the information you need to answer the fiscal solvency question in part 1 of your post-instructional assignment. So take a break to 5:20, come on back at 5:20, and we will do budget analysis. Okay, it's 5:20, actually 5:21, so a bit late, but welcome back. I kind of want to shift gears. I know it's kind of we're spend over an hour talking about budget formats. How we're going to completely shift gears and talk about budget analysis. But I think it's important that we talk about budget analysis and with an eye on the purpose of why we're analyzing the budget for. Essentially, there are a lot of different ways in which we analyze budgets. There are very good careers that are to be had as budget analysts. The goal here is not to turn you into a budget analyst. We don't have the time or the wherewithal to do that in this class. But I do think it's important to expose you to some basic analytical tools that you can use to analyze budget documents, both budgets themselves as well as annual comprehensive financial reports. Because as we had said a couple of times in this class up to this point, if you want to understand and get a holistic picture, a complete picture of the finances of a city, The two documents you look at are the budget and the annual comprehensive financial report. You combine those two documents together, it gives you the prospective of what the government plans to spend its money on in the future year, and the retrospective, which comes from the annual comprehensive financial report, of how they actually spent their money. So you combine those two together, you analyze those two documents, and that will then give you a pretty good, complete, holistic picture of the financial health of that city. So we need to talk about some of the ways in which we can do that, some of the ways in which we can analyze our budget documents. And again, what I have found over the years is the best way to communicate this information is to link it up to the purpose that we're using those analytical tools for. So we're going to organize all these tools according to why we would use them. So one of the first reasons why we would want to analyze budget documents is for the purpose of forecasting revenues. Obviously, it's important that we have an idea of how much revenue we are bringing in before we can determine how much money we have to spend and what we are going to spend that money on. So we do a lot of analysis and forecasting of revenues. We talked about the budgeting process last week, which seems like it was a month ago, but we talked about the budgeting process at the federal level. We talked about the 4 different phases of the budgeting process. And the first phase or cycle we talked about being preparation. We say, well, the major things that we do in preparation is we forecast our revenues. And we have that done by OMB and CBO and these other types of organizations. So how do they then forecast revenue? Well, there are a lot of different strategies we can use to forecast revenue, running from very crude and simplistic to much more sophisticated and complicated. So one of the easiest and crudest ways, if you will, to forecast revenue is by using univariate approaches, meaning one variable approaches, like prior moving averages and prior moving changes. And if you've used Excel before, you know Excel can very easily calculate for you your prior moving averages and prior moving changes for doing revenue forecasting. Prior moving averages, you typically take the last 3 years of revenue and take the average of those 3 numbers, and then the average of those 3 numbers will then become your forecast for your next year's revenue. So when you had the last 3 years, add them up, divide by 3, and that average then becomes your forecast for next year. Very simple, very quick, take you a couple seconds to do it. The problem, obviously, with prior moving averages is if you have any trend lines to your revenue data. So if you have revenue that is going up or revenue that's been going down, prior moving averages won't really take into account those trends. And so let's say, for example, you want to use prior moving averages to try and forecast the price of a home next year. So you take the value of the home over the past 3 years, and you use that to then forecast what the value of the home will be next year. If the value of that property is going up, I'm trying to do this in my camera, so it's going up, so you've got this incline to the amount, the property value, then you're going to serially under forecast what it will be next year because you're not taking into account that upward increase. And so usually it tends to be too conservative of a forecast for next year, just simply using prior moving averages. But it's quick and it's easy, it's univariate, you're not using any other additional variables to make your forecast. Another technique that's related to prior moving averages is prior moving changes. And prior moving changes, you'll look at the percentage change from 1 year to the next, take the average percentage change, and then use that to make your revenue forecast for next fiscal year. So you average out your percent changes for your previous 3 years, and then use that average to then calculate your forecasted revenue for the next fiscal year. Same type of thing as with prior moving averages. It kind of under forecasts and is too conservative of a forecast oftentimes for your next fiscal year. But those are very simple, very easy things to do. We do see local governments forecasting the revenue with prior moving averages and prior moving changes. When I was on a school board, our assistant superintendent of business, his primary way of forecasting revenue was through prior moving averages, even though it is a very limited type of technique. So if you want to get a little bit more sophisticated, then you have bivariate regression. And if you've had the 696 research methods class, or you had statistics at your undergraduate level of education, I'm sure you talked about bivariate regression. relationship between two variables. Here in the world of revenue forecasting, we refer to bivariate regression as deterministic modeling. Deterministic modeling, we will use one variable to then predict our revenue forecast. So you may say we're going to look at the gross domestic product, the GDP, and we'll use the GDP and changes in the GDP to then predict the amount of revenue we'll be able to forecast next year. It's your very simple bivariate regression equation. Your y equals a plus bx. The x is the variable you're using, so that's the value of your gross domestic product. The y is what you're predicting, which is your revenue. The b is your slope. So for every 1 unit change in your gross domestic product, what is the corresponding change to the amount of revenue that you are generating? So if our gross domestic product increases by 1%, what does that 1% increase in gross domestic product mean for the amount of revenue we can anticipate generating next year? So obviously it's a little bit more sophisticated than prior moving averages and prior moving changes, because now we are using another variable to predict our revenue that we are forecasting. So we're using a separate variable, oftentimes, like I said, gross domestic product, in order to forecast our revenue. A more sophisticated approach is multivariate regression. And it's, again, if you've taken statistics, you know in multiple regression, you look at the impact of a variety of independent variables on your dependent variable. So gross domestic product may be a variable, independent variable 1, and then we may have corporate sales as another one for variable number 2, and so on and so on. So we'll take the values of multiple independent variables and use those multiple independent variables to create a forecasting equation to then allow us to forecast the amount of revenue we would anticipate. So given these values and all of our different independent variables, what revenue amount would we predict we'll be able to generate next year? Clearly, since we're taking into account additional variables, it becomes a more sophisticated and hopefully a more accurate approach than just simply bivariate or deterministic modeling. And deterministic modeling hopefully is a more accurate approach than univariate modeling approaches like prior moving averages and prior moving changes. A more advanced approach beyond multiple regression is econometrics. I don't know if you've ever had any courses in econometrics. Econometrics is a more sophisticated approach whereby we really kind of dive into what we call our error term. So you see in multiple regression that a regression equation, the y equals a plus, you don't really need a, but y equals a plus b1, x1, b2, x2, so on and so on. And you see at the end it's plus e. And as you know from statistics, that E stands for your error term. So you use that multiple regression equation to predict the amount of revenue you're going to generate. The difference between the amount that you predict you're going to generate and the actual amount that you generate, that's what we consider to be error. In multiple regression, we don't worry all that much about what makes up that error term, that difference between our prediction and what actually happened. In econometrics, we're very concerned about that error term. And we really dig into what comprises that error term and why there was that difference between what we predicted and then what actually happened. Econometrics, again, is a more sophisticated approach that's well beyond our scope here in 555 to talk about, but I'll just give you one example of how far we have come in terms of revenue forecasting. When I taught in Illinois several years ago, I taught the budgeting class, no big surprise there. But at the end of every semester, I would get contacted by the State Bureau of the Budget. That's what they call their budget agency in Illinois, the Illinois BOB, the Bureau of the Budget. And the Bureau of the Budget would contact me and say, do you have any students who are graduating who finished your public budgeting course? Because we need to hire budget analysts. And so they would ask me that every semester. My first couple of years on faculty, when I would get those requests, they would ask for people who were graduating with their master's degree, who had completed my budgeting course, and who had a working familiarity with multiple regression. And those were their 3 requirements. And we had several people who were able to forward on to the Bureau of the Budget who had short but productive careers as budget analysts. Oftentimes people go to the Bureau of the Budget as a budget analyst, and then their work as a budget analyst, they would make contact with other state agencies and then get hired away by those other state agencies. And so that's why it was kind of a stepping stone to better jobs in other state agencies. By my last couple of years in Illinois, they were asking for people who are graduating their masters, people who had finished the budgeting course, and people who had experience with econometrics. And just in that 2-year period of time, they now were using econometrics as their primary forecasting tool to replace multiple regression. And forecasting has continued to become more sophisticated with each passing year. Another approach that we can use to forecast our revenue is what's called microdata simulations. And we see this a lot with tax policy. And we just had a big tax decrease, a big tax bill in the Trump administration, I always forget the name of it, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I believe it was called, in 2017. And whenever we have these big tax cuts, we have to try and determine what's the impact of this tax cut on the amount of tax revenue the federal government will be able to generate. Is this going to have a big decrease in the amount of revenue that we'll have coming into federal government coffers? So we do microdata simulations. One microdata simulation approach we can use is what's called static scoring. In static scoring, you will look at the tax bill and you'll ask, okay, how much less revenue will we get next year as a result of these tax breaks? And then that's how you score the bill, by however much it's decreasing tax revenue next year. That's a static scoring type of a model. In a static scoring model, you don't take into account the potential that reducing tax rates may actually stimulate economic activity, which could then in the future lead to additional revenue coming into the federal government. Because the idea is if you cut taxes and it works the way in which you think it's going to work, then you will stimulate the economy by putting more money into the economy. By putting more money into the economy, then consumption will go up. As consumption goes up and sales go up, then corporations will be doing better. As corporations are doing better, then they have to pay more taxes, and then more money rolls into the federal treasury. Taking that approach, assuming that by cutting taxes today, you'll have stimulated economic growth in the future, is what's known as a dynamic scoring model. And in that last the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill, we saw Democrats taking a static scoring type of approach and Republicans taking a dynamic scoring approach. So the Republicans arguing this is going to stimulate the economy and actually will make money in the future, despite having less money coming in next year as a result of these tax cuts. So again, that's a very politically charged type of way to look at tax cuts, either static or dynamic scoring. Those who are in favor of the tax cuts always use dynamic scoring. Those who are not in favor of the tax cuts are always going to use static scoring. Let me go ahead and make this bigger. I didn't realize that we hadn't actually started it. So there we go. So we can use a variety of different budget analysis techniques for the purpose of revenue forecasting. Katerina, go ahead.
Could you say again what political party uses static versus dynamic scoring?
Yeah, it depends upon the party that's supporting the tax cut. And so if the party supporting the tax cuts, the Republican Party, like it was in 2017, they would use dynamic scoring because they could argue that even though we're going to lose some revenue next year, the economic stimulus that will come as a result of these tax cuts will allow us to generate more money in future years, thus paying for the tax cuts next year. Democrats or those whoever is opposing the tax cut will use a static scoring model, and they won't take into account any of that economic stimulation in the future. They will simply say, this is going to cost us X billion dollars next year because there's less tax revenue coming in as a result of these tax cuts. So usually, whoever opposes the tax cut takes a static scoring approach. Whoever approves of and supports the tax cut usually takes a dynamic scoring approach. So it does become very, very political. Another purpose that we can use budget analysis for is cost estimation. So we can forecast our revenues, but we also have to estimate our costs. It's a two-part type of deal. So in cost estimation, some of the analytical tools we can use is we have to estimate our personnel costs. Estimating personnel costs is relatively simple. It's salary and benefits, and we know that salary and benefits will comprise anywhere from about 85 to 90% of most public agency budgets. You're spending the vast majority of your money on personnel, but it's a pretty easy thing to calculate salary and benefits. Non-personnel costs can be a little bit trickier depending upon the non-personnel costs that you're trying to estimate. One simple way to estimate non-personnel costs is volume times unit price. So how much does it cost per unit? How many units are you purchasing? And so you're purchasing staples for your office for next year. Well, what's the unit cost per box, and how many boxes are you purchasing? Pretty straightforward again. Another non-personnel cost estimation technique is workload times average unit cost. This is essentially days times cost per day. So this would be useful if you are bringing in a consultant or you're bringing in somebody to do training. What's their cost per day that they're charging for this consulting, and then how many days will they be there? Again, a relatively simple type of calculation. Another way we can estimate costs is by using what we call workforce ratios. And so we compare an apple to an orange, essentially. So we use, for instance, a vehicle to staff ratio. So we ask, how many vehicles do we have per staff member? So maybe we have 0.1 vehicles per staff member, or we have 0.8 vehicles per staff member. You're kind of indexing the number of vehicles to the number of employees that you have, called a workforce ratio. But what we usually use for non-personnel costs is we typically do something to try and adjust to a prior year cost. We oftentimes will do things like discounting through using a cost of doing business factor or the consumer price index, realizing that the value of money changes over time. So the value of money today is different than what it was last year or 10 years ago. And the value of money today is different than it will be next year or 10 years in the future. One approach we oftentimes use is what's called constant dollar years. And so we'll ask the question, here's $1,000 that we have today. How much was that $1,000 worth back in 1980? And how much do we think that $1,000 will be worth in 2040? So we have to try and index the value of money today to what it was worth in the past versus what it may be worth in the future. Adjustment to prior year cost. And so a couple of ways we can do that is we can use devices known as either compounding or discounting. And we'll get to compounding and discounting in just a second. A third approach that we use when we want to analyze budgets is we can use what's called a break-even analysis. Now, we work under the assumption that government agencies are nonprofit in orientation. Unlike private sector companies, we do not operate in order to run a profit. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Public corporations oftentimes are allowed to run a profit. So the U.S. Postal Service, not that it does, but it's allowed to run a profit because it's a public government corporation. But for the most part, most truly governmental organizations are nonprofit types of entities. So whenever they are providing and producing a good or service, they need to take into account their break-even point, so they're not running a profit. So break-even analysis does that. So break-even analysis will be the calculation of the point at which your total revenue is equal to your total cost. So here's an example to kind of illustrate that. Let's take trash collection as an example. So let's say we have a trash collection agency, a waste management authority, and that waste management authority charges $2 per 40-gallon container that they collect. So every 40-gallon container they collect, they're charging consumers $2 for the collection of that container. Let's assume that the costs associated with this collection, you have both fixed as well as variable costs. As you know from your economics courses, fixed costs are costs that you incur irrespective of the amount of a good you are producing. Variable costs are indexed directly to the amount that you produce. So fixed costs that are irrespective of the amount that you are producing. Things such as administrative costs. So you have to pay people to administer the program. Those are fixed costs. You have to lease the equipment. Those are fixed costs as well. So let's just say in this example, you have $35,000 in administrative costs and $85,000 in equipment leases. So you have a total of $120,000 in total fixed costs. Your variable costs, again, are going to be indexed to the amount of containers you are collecting. So let's say there's a landfill tipping fee of $1 per container. So for every container you collect, you have to dispose of it in the landfill, and you have to tip the landfill $1 for every container that's being emptied into the landfill. Let's say there's a 15-cent per container equipment operation cost and a 25% per container collection crew payment. So you have a total of $1.40 in total variable cost. So $1.40 in cost per container being collected. So in a break-even analysis, you would set your break-even point at the point at which total revenue equals total cost. Well, we know we're charging $2 per container. So our total revenue is $2 times the quantity we are collecting. So our total revenue is 2Q, Q standing for the quantity we collect. So 2 times the number of containers we collect. Our total cost will be the combination of our fixed cost plus our variable costs. So we said we have $120,000 in fixed costs, and we have $1.40 in variable costs per container we are collecting. So $1.40 times Q, the number of containers we collect. So our total cost is $120,000 plus 1.4Q, $1.40 times the quantity. So you set total revenue equal to total cost. We said our total revenue was 2Q. So 2Q equals $120,000 plus 1.4Q, which is our variable cost, and then you just work through the formula. So you're trying to isolate Q, so you subtract 1.4Q from both sides, you end up with 0.6Q equals $120,000. Isolate Q, you divide both sides by 0.6, you end up with $120,000 divided by 0.6, Q then equals 200,000. So you have 200,000 containers that you would have to collect in order to break even, given your total cost as well as your total revenue. So that's your break-even point, the collection of 200,000 containers. But again, we do this as a governmental entity because we are a nonprofit. We want to avoid running a profit. So we want to charge the amount that will allow us to balance our revenue with our costs. But why else might we want to do budget analysis? Another reason we might want to do budget analysis is to choose between programs and projects. And one of our primary tools we use in choosing between programs and projects is a cost-benefit analysis. Now, some people obviously refer to this as a benefit cost analysis. I guess it depends on whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty type of person. I guess I'm glass half empty because I refer to it as cost benefit. I put cost first. But it's the same thing, benefit cost or cost benefit analysis. So say, for instance, we are comparing 2 different capital projects. So one project we could pursue would be the construction of a recreation center. The other project we could pursue could be the construction of a senior citizen center. So what we have to do is decide which of those 2 projects is most advantageous for us to put our money behind and for us to build. So we use a cost-benefit analysis. In a cost-benefit analysis, we examine our goals and objectives in completing these projects, and then we will examine the costs associated with the projects versus the benefits associated with those projects. So we'll identify and monetize our costs, and we'll identify and monetize our benefits. Now, next week, when we get into a discussion of capital budgeting and debt management, we will get into a much more in-depth discussion of cost-benefit analysis and identifying some of the costs and some of the benefits associated with capital projects. But just for our purposes now, we'll look at both of those projects and we will identify and monetize, which means add a dollar value to the cost and the benefits. The idea being, do the benefits exceed the costs? Well, the problem for us is that costs and benefits don't all occur at the same time. So when you think about some of the benefits that will occur with a recreation center, All of those benefits, things such as a healthier population, perhaps lower rates of disease, more work productivity, because the healthier people are, the less they'll call off sick from work, and the more productive your workforce will be. Those benefits don't all happen on day one when the recreation center opens its doors. Those are benefits that are going to accrue over time as more and more people use the recreation center and then develop the benefits of being healthier by using that recreation center. So not everything, now the benefits happen at once. Benefits that we get today are not worth the same amount as benefits that we may get a year from now. Think about if I say on January 1st, I'm going to give you $1,000, or I can wait and give you $1,000 on December 31st. The $1,000 I give you on January 1st is more valuable to you than the $1,000 you would wait until December 31st to get. Because that money you get on January 1st, clearly, obviously, you can invest that money. So you take that $1,000 on January 1st, you invest it, and then you'll have more than $1,000 come December 31st. So you're better off getting those benefits today than waiting to December 31st. So what we need to do whenever we identify and monetize our costs and benefits is we need to translate present value into future value, or sometimes future value into present value. So to take the present value and transform it into future value, we're doing what is called compounding. So we are basically just take the amount that we're getting today and take into account our interest rate and how much that interest rate is, which will then tell us how much we'll have on December 31st in a future value. So that's what's called compounding, going from a present value to a future value. The opposite of that is discounting, and this is what we do a lot of in our cost-benefit analysis. We will take a future value and we will discount it to its present value. So this is what it will be worth a year from now. This is what that is then worth today. So $1,000 on December 31st may only be worth $950 today, depending upon your prevailing interest rate. So the formula on the screen is just a really simple one of how you go from future value to present value, how you discount future values back to present values. You take your future value, so $1,000, divide it by 1 plus R, which is your rate of return, which is how much you could have invested that money for, raised to the N power, and the N stands for number of compounding periods. So you get interest compounded once a year or twice a year or quarterly, which would be 4 times per year. So the future value divided by 1 plus the rate of return raised to the compounding periods will then give you the present value of that future value of money. So we do that all the time in terms of discounting. So any future values that we're going to get from this recreation center, we have to discount those future values back to what those benefits would be worth today in their present value. Once we have discounted from those future values we're going to get back to present values, then what we can do is we can then take those present values of our benefits and present value of our costs, and we can calculate this thing called the benefit cost ratio, or the BCR. And the primary statistic that we calculate with cost benefit analysis is the benefit cost ratio. The present value of your benefits divided by the present value of your costs. Now, obviously, in order for a project to be fiscally worth pursuing or fiscally viable, our numerator must be bigger than our denominator. So our present value of our benefits must be greater than our present value of our costs. That will give us a BCR in excess of 1. If our present value of our benefits and present value of our costs are equal to each other, we end up with a benefit cost ratio of 1. If our costs are greater than our benefits, then we end up with a BCR of less than 1. So we'll put together our benefit cost ratio for the recreation center and also for the senior center, and we'll see what our BCR comes out as. If our BCR for the recreation center is a 1.3 and our BCR for the senior center is a 0.85, that's a clear indication we should put our resources behind constructing the recreation center as opposed to the senior center. We can also just do a simple subtraction of take our present value of our benefits, subtract our present value of our costs, and see what net present value of benefits is greater for either the recreation center or for the senior center. Now, it sounds very simple to do that type of cost benefit analysis. It clearly is not that simple. And next week, when we talk about cost benefit analysis, I'll walk you through an example of a cost benefit analysis for a decision of whether or not to tax alcoholic beverages. And we'll kind of go through all of the externalities that are associated with doing a cost benefit analysis and why a cost benefit analysis is a lot more difficult to do than it just sounds like this week. So we'll kind of get into some of those nuances of cost benefit analysis next week. What will be very useful for you when you get to your budgeting case study in 697 is the ability to calculate simple growth rates and then use those growth rates in order to make projections for future years. So let's just this is information you probably covered before in economics course, and so you probably know how to do this, but just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page, because this is the type of skill you're going to need to use on that budgeting case study. How do you calculate growth rates, and then how do you use those growth rates in order to make projections into future years? Whether you're projecting revenue or whether you're estimating costs, how do you use those types of growth rates to make accurate projections? A very simple formula for calculating growth rates is you'll take the value in the last year of your data. So let's say you've got 10 years of revenue data, and you want to use the 10 years of revenue data to then project the amount of revenue you can anticipate getting in a future year. So you take the last year, and that then in your formula is your XL, that's the value of revenue in your last time period that you have. X1 is then the value of the revenue in the first time period. So from however many years back you want to go, you pick that first time period, and that's then the value at X1. So you take XL, your last value, divided by the first value, and then you raise that to the 1 divided by T power, and T stands for the number of time intervals that are transpiring between when you have your data and when you are predicting. And then you subtract the entire thing from 1. So let me just go through the example and make that clearer. I know it's kind of a little muddy. So you see in the example in your growth rate, you've got your formula there. R equals XL divided by X1 raised to the 1 divided by T power, whole thing subtracted from 1. So let's say, for example, the amount of revenue in the last year of data we have was $675,018. In the year before that, it was $648,747. So the 675,018 is your XL, the 648,747 is your X1. So you divide those numbers, and then you raise it to the 1 divided by T power. Since we're only looking at 1 year, we're saying this year compared to the year before, then that T would become 1. So it's 1 divided by 1. If, however, there are 2 years between our first number and our second number, then that would be 1 divided by 2. If there are 3 years, it would be 1 divided by 3, and so on and so on. But for our purposes, we're just looking at this year and the year before that. So it's 1 divided by T, so you're just raising it to the first power. So when you do your division, you subtract it from 1, you end up with rate of growth of 4.05%. So $675,018 is 4.05% greater than the previous year's amount of revenue, which was $648,747. So your revenue has grown by 4.05% from 1 year to the next. That's your growth rate. Then you can take that growth rate and you can use it to make your projections into future years. So let's say we want to then project our revenue in 2 years into the future. So not next year, but the year past that, 2 years in the future. So to do that projection, we use that simple formula under projection for 2 years in the future. Our projection, which is our F, equals XL, that amount in that last year, $675,018, times 1 plus that rate we just calculated, the growth rate, 4.05%, which is 0.0405, raised to the second power because we are projecting 2 years into the future. You work through those calculations and you end up with a projection 2 years in the future of $730,801. So that then is our projection 2 years in the future based upon what we have accumulated in terms of data over the past several years. So that's how you would calculate growth rates and then use those growth rates to then make projections. And again, once you get to your 555 case study, chances are you're probably going to have to use growth rates and projections in answering some of the questions on that case study. So I just kind of want to make sure that you are aware of that as part of our discussion of analytical tools. Before we get into governmental accounting, though, because I don't think we're really going to have time to really devote to government accounting tonight, because we're already at 6 o'clock, let me go ahead and stop the share and then share with you some analytical techniques that we can use to assess the fiscal solvency of cities. Because at the end of the day, when we're looking at budgets and annual comprehensive financial reports, we are analyzing those documents for a purpose. And the primary purpose we're analyzing them for is to determine the fiscal solvency of the city. So let me go ahead and share out again that PDF, wherever it's at. Let me just share this and then we'll, okay. On our website, on our Beachboard site, I provided for you this file, which is essentially an article that exposes you to several of the different approaches and indicators we can use to analyze the fiscal solvency of a government. And the two basic categories of indicators that we use are Brown's and then Dennis, Wang, and Two's. Those are two different categories of indicators. The way in which this works in terms of analyzing fiscal solvency is you will take your city, and you don't have to do the comparison in your post instruction, so don't worry about doing it this way, but typically if you're going to do it, you take your city and you compare that city, your city, to at least 5 other comparable cities. So you find 5 other cities that are comparable to your city in terms of size and demographics and all those types of things. And then you will calculate these indicators for your city, the 5 comparable cities, and then see where your city is in comparison to those 5 comparable cities. Sometimes you can do more, some people will do 10, but you're comparing your city to comparable cities. And then you're looking at where your city falls in terms of the top 25%, the middle 50%, the bottom 25% on all these indicators in comparison to your comparison cities. That's kind of how we assess fiscal solvency. So let me show you Brown's 10-point test for fiscal solvency, go through those indicators, and then I'll show you Dennis, Wang, and Two, or Wang, Dennis, and Two's, and their indicators, which are slightly different than the indicators that Brown uses. So one way to assess fiscal solvency is to use Brown's 10-point test. And you'll see the 10-point test there in this file on your screen. There are 10 different indicators that Brown recommends we use in order to compare the fiscal solvency of our city to the comparable cities that we have selected. Some of these indicators are very straightforward and very easy. Brown's indicators tend to be more straightforward than the next set we'll talk about with Wang, Dennis, and Two. Brown's tend to be pretty straightforward. So your first indicator is a real straightforward one. It measures your revenue for your city. It's total revenues per capita. So it's a real simple calculation. You take your total revenue for all of your governmental funds, and we'll talk about governmental funds in accounting next week, but your general fund and your special revenue fund and all your funds, with the exception of your capital projects fund. The capital projects fund is dedicated for money that is earmarked for the creation of capital projects, like creating buildings and things such as that. But all your other funds, you take all the revenues flowing into all those other governmental funds, and you divide your total revenue by your population, which gives you your total revenue per person, your total revenue per capita. You then take that, you do that for all of your comparison cities, and then you compare how your city scores on total revenue per capita in comparison to all the comparison cities. Is it in the top 25%, the middle 50%, the bottom 25%? You then have a second indicator known as intergovernmental revenues divided by total revenues percentage. So you take your intergovernmental revenues for your general fund. Your general fund is the primary fund that cities use for their everyday operations to keep the city going on a daily basis. Intergovernmental revenues are revenues that come in from other governments. And so state grant money, federal grant money, that's considered intergovernmental revenue. So you take all the intergovernmental revenue you're generating in your general fund and divide it by all the revenue that you are generating for your general fund to see what percentage intergovernmental revenue accounts for, or what percentage of your total revenue is accounted for by intergovernmental revenue. What this tells you is it tells you how reliant you are on money from other governments. Obviously, the more reliant you are on money from other governments, the less control you have over your own fiscal solvency. You want to be more reliant upon sources of revenue that you have direct control over. Intergovernmental grants are not assured. Intergovernmental grants may go away next year or the year after that. And so if you're heavily reliant upon grants from other governments, you could be very fiscally unstable. Next one, another revenue type of indicator, property tax or own source tax revenues divided by total revenues, a percentage. And so again, these are all ratios that you're calculating. So you take your total tax revenues that you charge locally in your general fund. For a lot of governments, that'll be primarily property tax revenue, but revenues that you have direct control over, tax revenues you have direct control over, divided by your total general fund revenue. Again, this is a measure of the amount of control you have over your own fiscal destiny. So those are three revenue ratios that you can use to measure fiscal solvency. Again, you're calculating for your city, your comparison cities, and then you're making that comparison between your city and comparable cities. The fourth indicator is total expenditures per capita, just like total revenues. Now we're going to do it for total expenditures per person. The next one is an operating position indicator, operating surplus or deficit divided by operating revenues. And so you're creating a percentage of your operating surplus or deficit divided by your operating revenues. Again, to see how well you are balancing your budget as an indicator of fiscal solvency. The next operating position indicator you can use is enterprise funds working capital coverage percentage. What this means is you look at your enterprise funds. We'll talk about enterprise funds next week. But enterprise funds are usually for revenue that's being generated through the operation of some type of a public enterprise. So if you're running a utility, or like in my school district, we had a child development program that was an enterprise fund. That would be considered enterprise type of revenue. So you take the current assets of your enterprise funds and divide them by the current liabilities of those enterprise funds. So the current assets of your enterprise funds are the value of everything you have. So in terms of the value of your building and the value of your supplies and all those types of things, those are your assets. Liabilities are claims against those assets. So what types of claims are people or organizations making against those assets? So the current assets divided by the current liabilities of your enterprise fund. So for example, for that child development program, would be your indicator known as enterprise funds working capital coverage percentage. That's just another indicator of fiscal solvency. Clearly, if your assets are much greater than your liabilities, that's an indicator of fiscal solvency. The reverse would just be the inverse logic. You can also measure debt indicators as well in Brown's 10-point indicators. So the next one is a debt indicator, long-term debt divided by assessed value percentage. Now, we haven't talked a lot about taxation yet. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But assessed valuation is an indicator of the tax capacity of your jurisdiction. It's an indicator of the ability of your jurisdiction to generate money through tax revenue. So what you're doing here is you're taking your long-term general obligation debt, and again, we'll talk about general obligation debt next week. But general obligation debt is essentially debt where you promise that you will repay. that you use all your resources at your disposal to repay the investors who purchase your general obligation debt. So your long-term general obligation debt that is matures in more than 1 year, divided by the assessed value of your property, your tax capacity. Another debt indicator, debt service divided by operating revenues. Debt service is the amount of money you have to pay every year in principal and interest payments to maintain the debt that you have borrowed. We all have to make payments, principal and interest payments on any debt we have incurred. That's called debt service. So you take the amount that you're paying on to maintain your debt, divide it by your total general fund revenue. That's an indicator of debt service, operating revenues percentage. And then the final one on here looks at your unfunded liabilities. A lot of governments, especially state governments, have run into a lot of trouble in terms of having large amounts of unfunded liabilities in their pension plans. State of Illinois is a great example. The state of Illinois pension plan is horribly unfunded, so much so that it's somewhat unlikely that in 10 years there'll be enough money to pay retirees whenever they retire. California is in better shape with CalPERS and CalSTRS and their types of retirement programs than Illinois, but you really want to know just how good a shape you are in terms of your pension programs. So this one's the post-employment benefit assets divided by liabilities. In this one, you're taking a ratio of the assets in your pension fund divided by the liabilities against that pension fund. So again, just kind of looking at your pension fund and how underfunded or hopefully overfunded that pension fund is. Let's see, Joe, let's question. If we use Brown's 10-point test, do we have to test all indicators to get an idea of solvency, or we can pick and choose a few to utilize to determine solvency? That's a great question. It depends. My favorite answer, it depends. It depends on the purpose of the assessment for fiscal solvency. If you're looking at assessing fiscal solvency for the purpose of awarding a credit rating to a city, you're probably going to do all 10 and then some, because you're going to be very comprehensive in assigning that credit rating, because you want to make sure the city has fiscal solvency as worthy of a very good credit rating before you assign that credit rating. So Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch's, a lot of these credit rating agencies will go through all these indicators and then some. For our purposes in this class, I'm hoping that you will look at maybe 2 or 3. And you don't have to go through all of them, just 2 or 3 to give me an example that you can calculate these ratios to kind of get an idea of fiscal solvency. So for us, 2 or 3, if you're a credit rating agency, you're going to be doing all of them. But that's a very good question. But 2 or 3 is good enough for our purposes. And also for our purposes, in answering that fiscal solvency question on part 1 of the post-instructional, you don't have to do this for comparison cities either. I'm not going to ask you to go out there and do it for 10 or 15 cities. Just do it for your city, 2 or 3 of these indicators. Just kind of demonstrate that you can calculate these ratios and then use that to help answer that question on fiscal solvency. So we're just going to take a very limited approach here in this class. So don't worry about doing it for any other cities except just the city that you're looking at in your post-instructional. That's a great question. You're very welcome. So that's Brown's 10-point scale as 10-point indicators. Again, just some indicators you can calculate in order to look at fiscal solvency. Then there are another set of indicators oftentimes used in the industry known as Wang, Dennis, and Tu's solvency test. And Wang, Dennis, and Tu use different indicators, and they use indicators that are oftentimes coming more from the annual comprehensive financial report than maybe coming from the budget itself. And they're not quite as intuitive as the Brown 10-point indicators. So they're a little bit tougher to kind of conceptualize. But here are the Wang, Dennis, and Tu fiscal indicators for fiscal solvency. And we'll talk through some of these, but usually I said most people will use 2 or 3 out of Brown's because they tend to be a little bit more intuitive and straightforward. But the first indicator in Wang, Dennis, and Tu is a cash solvency indicator. And the cash solvency indicator, you will take the amount of cash on hand plus what we call cash equivalents. Cash equivalents in accounting are things such as if your city owns treasury bills, if your city owns federal debt, that's oftentimes considered to be a cash equivalent. Certificates of participation, as we'll talk about next week in debt management. things that are very liquid, things that are very sure, things that are very certain that you can get your money out of very quickly. Those are things we refer to as cash equivalent. So you take your cash plus those cash equivalents, plus investments that again are relatively liquid that you can get access to relatively quickly, and you divide that by your current liability. So you're basically looking at essentially how much cash can get your hands on very quickly, divided by the liabilities that are currently being placed against your assets. So basically, how much money can you get quickly divided by how much money do you owe right now? That's essentially what it measures in kind of layman terms. That's what's called your cash ratio. This information on the amount of cash, cash equivalents, investments, that information you won't find in your budget probably. That's information you'll probably find in your annual comprehensive financial report. And we'll talk more about annual comprehensive financial reports next week when we talk about accounting. And I've also provided a video for you on our Beachboard site that kind of walks you through how to read an annual comprehensive financial report and where you get all this information that you need for these indicators within that annual comprehensive financial report. So that's some information we'll get into next week. Our quick ratio, which is also a cash solvency measure, cash plus cash equivalents plus investments plus receivables. So the value of receivables that you have received into inventory, because ostensibly you could then liquidate those receivables if you needed to. So you include those receivables in your calculation under a quick ratio as well. Your current ratio, your current assets divided by your current liabilities. Operating ratio, total revenues divided by total expenses. It's a pretty clear-cut one. And that's one a couple people used in their pre-instructional assignment. And so that's certainly a usable type of indicator. Your surplus or deficit per capita, very similar to what we saw in the Brown indicators. Surplus or deficit per individual, per member, per individual in your city, per population, I guess I probably shouldn't say. Your net asset ratio, so your restricted and unrestricted net assets divided by total assets. So basically the assets that don't have claims against them divided by your total assets, even if they do have claims against them. A long-term liability ratio, your long-term liabilities that are not current, meaning in this year, the liabilities that are going to come due in future years divided by all of your assets. Long-term liability per capita, so again, liabilities that will come due in future years divided by your population. Tax per capita, total taxes divided by your population. Revenue per capita, total revenue divided by population. And expenses per capita, total expenses divided by population. So again, some of these are pretty straightforward. Some are a little bit more convoluted and require going through the annual comprehensive financial report. Population is information that you will find in your annual comprehensive financial report. We'll look at that next week. But in annual comprehensive financial reports, there are different sections. The last section in any annual comprehensive financial report is what's called the statistical section. It's the statistical section where you will find population, population trends, that type of information you need for some of these indicators you get in the statistical section. Current assets, current liabilities, long-term assets, long-term liabilities, those are all found in the annual comprehensive financial report in the financial section. And again, when we get into next week, I'll show you specifically where you find that information and then show you the link to the video so that you can go on your own and kind of figure out where this information is in those types of financial reports. But again, the purpose here is just to introduce you to some actual indicators that you can use to assess fiscal solvency, to go beyond just saying, well, revenues are higher than expenditures, which is a very basic measure. Here are some more nuanced, sophisticated measures that can be used. Again, using 2 or 3 of them to answer the fiscal solvency question on the post-instructional would certainly make me very happy, and that's all I'm really expecting. And just doing it for your city rather than using comparison cities, as we usually would do if we were doing this for real in the real world of public budgeting. But this file is called McDonald, and this file is available under the resources for this week's class. So feel free on your own spare time to go through and for your city, go and calculate a few of these, because again, that will be something that will help you answer the fiscal solvency question once we get to the post-instructional assignment. So the nice thing about this is, again, we're always looking for those empirical indicators of enhancement of skills from the beginning of a class to the end of the class. And this fiscal solvency question is a real good empirical indicator of that. That for the vast majority of people, you probably weren't able to answer the fiscal solvency question, the pre-instructional, but you absolutely will be able to answer it on the post-instructional by selecting some of these fiscal solvency indicators. Okay. So that takes us through a really abbreviated discussion of analysis and budgeting. Again, I don't expect people to be budget analysts after this discussion, but to at least be introduced to some of the analytical tools that can be used and some of the purposes, some of the reasons why we use those tools in analyzing different aspects of our budgets and our city finances. It is very late in the class session, so we don't have time to get into accounting. I don't want to start accounting and then have to stop accounting in 20 minutes or so. So let's hold off on our discussion of accounting until next week. Next week, we'll start with a discussion of accounting. I want to introduce you to fund-based accounting versus fund-based accounting and accrual-based accounting. We'll talk about the generally accepted accounting principles, the Government Accounting Standards Board, some of the ways in which we do audits in our accounting process. And we'll do accounting in the first half of class next week. And then the second half of class, we'll turn our attention to capital budgeting and debt management. We'll talk again in depth about cost-benefit analysis and how we use cost-benefit analysis for making our capital projects decisions. And then we'll talk about how we fund those capital projects through the issuance of short-term and or long-term debt. So accounting and then capital budgeting and debt management for next week. Any general questions about any of this information that we've covered so far tonight? Again, based upon the information tonight, you now have the information you need to do your beach board assignment for next week, looking at the budget format for your city. Please do provide a link in your post for me so I can go and look at your budget format and then give you some formative feedback in terms of whether or not I agree that that's the budget format and why I agree or why I don't agree. So you have the information to do that. And you also have the information now for your part one of your post-instructional assignment. Now you're able to do part one of the post-instructional assignment. So if you want to get that out of the way, you have all the information you need in order to do part one of the post-instruction. All right. As always, any questions that emerge between now and next Tuesday, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. I'll have this recording up on our Beachboard site no later than tomorrow morning for you to review. And otherwise, I will talk to you then next Tuesday. So take care, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.